you might have noticed recently that something else came along with the Race to World First ending. What came along was also a legendary item. Something that Blizzard has been doing recently, and by recently I mean basically once in Aberrus with the Evoker legendary after introducing the Evoker class in Dragonflight and then augmentation in Aberrus. We got the legendary, but that was for just one class, and the legendary itself didn't have a particularly shiny effect really. However, this time around, with this other raid, we are getting a much bigger, thicker and fatter legendary because it is a pure DPS two-handed weapon, which multiple classes of course can get their hands on. Paladin, DK and Warrior. Now, if you haven't followed, of course, the method of acquisition of the axe itself, it does have, of course, a reasonably long list of things you have to make sure to collect over time, one of which is gonna come, of course, from the raid. Blizzard is also adding, with the greater and lesser embers of Fyrakk from the raid, some sort of bad luck protection to make sure that eventually, even if you don't loot the item itself, you can get over time the item anyways. Once you actually have the starting quest, you can start, your whole process of gathering multiple materials, multiple items, which players have already started complaining, pointing out that if you actually buy all of these things on the auction house, it's gonna cost you 400, 500, 600,000 gold, depending on where you are. Of course, in a few weeks, these prices will be crashing down, and now the price of the legendary will be much more attainable and much more manageable. However, as all of this is going down, there is also an interesting question. Because yes, you can get your legendary, and this legendary is planned to be quite strong, quite powerful. So, if you're looking, for example, if we take a look at the specs that at the moment can get their hands on this legendary, you have specs like the Warrior specs, as well as Paladin, which are currently middling in the raid, and then you have specs like Unholy and even the two-handed version of Frost DK, which is towards the bottom half. Even if we move over from the raid situations and we switch over to Mythic Plus, the results of the DK specs is still quite low, the results of the Warrior specs is average-ish, and then you have the slightly better Red Paladin. Now, what is interesting about this weapon is that the initial preliminary napkin math done around the effect of this legendary is even well above 10% damage increase. Now, this becomes, of course, interesting because once you look at the performance of the specs and you randomly gave them, for example, 10% more damage, Red Paladin, for example, could jump to 150k to match the damage of a Beast Mastery Hunter. Same goes for Fury, and same goes for Arms Warrior. Even if you were to move to the raiding, to a more single target setting, Red Paladin will also jump above basically all of the other specs and have the top parade damage out of all specs, quickly followed pretty much by all of the other two-handed specs right here. So you have this question about the power that this legendary will give to the two-handed specs in the raid, and also the other question on whether or not Blizzard took into account the balancing of these specs, keeping in mind that they would have gotten a very powerful legendary some weeks into the tier. Because, it's a bit malicious to say right now, but you could be saying that, for example, all of the top specs are nowhere close to being a two-handed weapon user, because Blizzard was expecting the two-handed weapon users to become much stronger 3-4 weeks, over a month into the season by getting this legendary. So they had to be tuned to be weaker at the release of the season to keep in mind, to account for the power boost they would have gotten once they acquired the legendary. It would feel kind of spooky right now if this bar right here was, for example, Unholy. Imagine if Unholy was already here, and on top of that they would get their hands on a legendary, buffing their damage by 15%, and they would end up like here, right? So it is an interesting question that could lead to some interesting answers by some players. For example, if I were a two-handed weapon user, which I technically am, but I don't think staves count in this argument. If I were, for example, a warrior, an arms warrior using a two-handed weapon, I would much rather have been here for the first month of the season rather than being here for the first 2 months of the season and then 2 months in suddenly jump to here because I get my hands on a legendary. That's gonna be quite late into the tier. The raid progression will be over, the tough parts of the raid will already be done and dusted, so all that will be left will be, at the very best, pushing Mythic Plus, and now being more viable and more meta in Mythic Plus because you have this two-handed legendary. But you did miss out on, you did skip all of the release of the season without being powerful, because you had to wait for the arrival, for the completion of this legendary on your character. But if this legendary looks, at the very least looks as powerful as it is suggested from the effect on the item itself, then this looks like it's what's gonna happen, that many of the, or most of these two-handed weapon users will have a significant jump in power come the time when they get their hands on this legendary. So I was wondering what the rest of the two-hander gang was thinking about. What were their thoughts on the acquisition of this legendary? Besides the time required to collect everything needed for the legendary and the cost of the materials needed to form this legendary, what were the general thoughts of the community around the method of acquisition, but more importantly, the time of acquisition and the power of the weapon in relation to the power of the specs that will be able to use this weapon, right? Because as mentioned, many of the specs right now are not even particularly weak. You could make the argument for a spec like Frost Decay, for example, but you can't really make it for something like Arms and Fury and Ret and even Unholy, especially when it comes to the raid. Imagine the weapon giving anywhere above 10% more damage, and all of these specs would be top damage dealers in the raid. And perhaps it would also be enough to bring them into meta territory in Mythic Plus. So what we would be effectively talking about now is a ticking meta time bomb. You have this bomb released at the release of the season, but the bomb is dormant. The bomb has a timer, has a countdown of 30, not minutes, days, 60 maybe days, maybe even 90 days. And then once the bomb goes off, suddenly you have this massive surge in performance, in power of a few specs. This could be the same, for example, if you were releasing something like a one-handed sword for casters, meaning mages and warlocks specifically could get their hands on it, and suddenly, once the legendary is completed, boost up in performance. This could be the same. Right now, mage, for example, Frost and Fire are not super weak, they're not underplayed, but they're also not the meta pick, they're also not the meta choice. So they can still find a spot, they can still find place to be used in the raid and in Mythic Plus, but as soon as they get their hands on the weapon, they will jump up and become the new S tier pick just because of the damage boost. That was and still is the interesting part around the debate for this weapon. Just at the moment, as I mentioned, it's mostly theory crafting, it's mostly speculation, but the possible power increase given by this weapon to all of the specs that would be able to equip this weapon eventually, once they actually get their hands on this weapon. I wanted to see and I wanted to hear your thoughts about the power level of this legendary, tied with the performance of the specs that can use this legendary and the impact it will have on the performance of these specs. Whether it is good to have a feature like this into a season, to know that maybe 1, 2, or 3 months into the season, certain specs will jump up and become much stronger than others out of nowhere, to know that you could be playing a spec that is weak at the start, but maybe 1 or 2 months into the season it will become stronger. Or if you think it's wrong, if you think it's bad, if you think having this type of damage, wild damage swings into a season is not that good. It's not good for the specs at the top who will lose their slot once the weak ones get their legendary. It's not good for the weak ones because they have to stay weak for 1, 2 or 3 months before they actually get the hand on the legendary that is supposed to make them very strong. That is the question and debate for today. Besides this, I'm going to leave you to the rest of your midweek tasks and duties, whatever you were doing. So, for now, leaving each other by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help, the growth of the channel, etc, etc. We know this already. You can do this, of course, also for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. With these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I just hope it doesn't turn into a clusterfuck, it doesn't turn into people screeching and screaming about the power of this legendary.